On today's episode of Work Life Unraveled, we unravel the telepathy tapes. If you haven't listened to the telepathy tapes, you are going to want to listen to the telepathy tapes after this podcast. We go in. It's going to be good. You've got to listen.
Welcome to Work Life Unraveled with Garland and Allison. Today is a special episode. Garland, you want to tell everybody about the podcast that you and I just can't stop talking about?
Yes. And it starts with Allison even telling me about this and saying, you need to listen. So it's the telepathy tapes, which is, I think, top podcast right now. It is really quite fascinating because I think you hear that and you just think, okay, what is this about? And until you, literally are hooked in episode one and then can binge the whole thing in like a few days. And so I started listening because I was like, okay, we love to talk about things when we're super interested in them. And so when I started, and I think I wasn't even finished with episode 2, and I had texted her like, oh my God, what is this? And so we were like, we have to talk about this.
Yeah.
So I'll let you give a synopsis because I feel like you're on it.
Well, it's so funny because I feel like I had been recommended this podcast just on Spotify a couple times, and I was like, I wonder what this is about. And then I heard the premise and I was like, oh, I absolutely have to listen. So the premise is that non-speaking autistics, so people with autism, have these extrasensory abilities that up until now have not been very widespread in their, I guess, study or in the knowledge that's out there or in kind of the common conversation in the disability community. And this journalist dives into a kind of a web of different people across the country with stories of kids who are non-speaking but use some sort of technology to communicate, whether that's a board with letters and colors and things like that, or whether it's a text-to-speech device. And there's a woman who is doing research to prove all of these extrasensory abilities with these non-speaking people with autism. And it's just a fascinating show. They go deep into the science and what this means for, the way that we study science, and we'll talk about some of that. But just thought it was such an important conversation to have and such an interesting topic. And both you and I have a heart for the disability community. And so just wanted to, dive in and tell more people about this great podcast.
Yes. And I feel like we're going to connect it to work and life in some way. So
Yes.
go on this adventure with us because it will come back around. It just circuitously probably doesn't look like it in the moment. I think I will start with the fact that the person who is doing this podcast is not someone who is bought in from the beginning.
Yes.
She's aware of it. She's heard about, this phenomena of autistic children being able to have conversations with their caregivers through telepathy. However, she has not actually witnessed it. She is a little skeptical and brings in some other people who are not necessarily bought and sold in any of this either. And I think that's important because when you do any kind of study, if you kind of already believe it, it's like confirmation bias. Like, I
Yep.
already know this is real. And so I'm going into it to prove that this is real. And so I think what was really interesting in just listening to this was her own discovery and her own awareness of, wow, like, and then witnessing it firsthand and being like, okay, there's something here. And so her even conducting the studies and choosing to go down this rabbit hole, so to speak, to understand it, I think is what got me a little like, okay, so you're not bought in, you're like trying to understand. And now here you are really more so like, why is this not more well known? And I think about that with a lot of stuff, especially things we don't understand. So they talk, I think, a lot about just paradigms of processing information in the sciences. She works with a professor, which I'm totally blanking on this professor's name at the moment, who has been doing this as her life's work and has been discredited because she has literally said, like, I've done the scientific studies using the tools that my peers use, and I am showing that some of the things that you all say is real is not real. And so just having that fundamental shift in differences almost kind of excommunicated her
Mm-hmm.
from her peers in the study that she has. So there's two things that they mention. It is the materialist paradigm and the idealism paradigm. And so, if I had to deduce this down, courtesy of the internet, the materialist paradigm is a philosophical view that all things in the universe are made of matter and are subject to physical processes.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we all remember from our science class, it's basically seeing is believing. If
Mm-hmm.
you can see it, if it's a physical process,
Mm-hmm.
it means it's happening, it's real, we have proof, something we can measure, something we can track, something we can record. Like if you go back to your science classes in your labs, that's what the experiments were all about, right? We had to be able to show that something happened and be able to, provide actual proof. Well, there's another school of thought, idealism, which is holding that consciousness is the fundamental substance of nature, which is there are things in this world, in this life, that are just naturally functioning that way and that you will not be able to show proof of in a very material way.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like hearing about this, just having it defined in this way,
Mm-hmm.
it really made it clear that everyone's not experiencing the world, which we talk about, in the same way. Some people are seeing things and need to physically touch something to know that it's real. Some people are feeling it,
Mm-hmm.
and that is enough for them to know that it is real.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to hand this over to you because I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, well, the professor is Dr. Diane Powell, and she is featured heavily throughout all the different episodes of the telepathy tapes. And I just want to point out that her coming forward and her speaking on this topic really is kind of a credibility killer in traditional academia and even in the world at large. I think, there's one area of life where people very openly accept things that they can't see, and that's, I think, spirituality and organized religion. But this is something that really tests people's, I guess, flexibility in their mindsets of what is possible, especially because there's this idea, I think, with people with autism who are non-speaking, that they're kind of locked in, like there's no one home, this is kind of a body, and there aren't thoughts, there isn't critical thinking. And this podcast really flies in the face of that, and is, I think we're in a revolutionary time, I think, in the way that we are equipping traditionally non-speaking people with autism in, spelling, which is something that they talk about, helping them to communicate. And, there's even controversy in that you might help hold their hands or, position their bodies in a certain way to be able to learn how to spell that, again, because of fine motor issues and things like that. But the idea is that when these people start to be able to spell, to communicate, to use these different devices, that they're talking about things that are shocking, that are really going to turn, people's ideas of consciousness and reality as we experience it on their heads. And to me, it just was a mind expanding experience. And also, just from my experience on the board of this foundation that has a camp for kids with physical disabilities, we see campers that have non-speaking, or that have autism and are non-speaking, or have other issues and are non-speaking. And if you spent any time with them, that there's more to the story. That there's a person in there. There are deep thoughts, there are feelings in there. And I'm excited about the possibilities of this podcast and what it represents. But it's also interesting the gatekeeping that happens within this community about not wanting those special abilities out in the world and talked about. And I don't know if that's partially, they don't want to have that manipulated or marketed or capitalized or commercialized, or what that might be. But I just feel like the potential of these people who are autistic and non-speaking is just unlimited. And I think the developments that we can make and the opportunities that we have as a culture to bring these people in and to accept these people and not other them are just limitless.
Yeah. I'm going to go back and just say, spoiler alert, if you have not listened,
Oh, yeah.
okay, we're going to start talking about the podcast as a like specific example. So I say that because I'm going to, you know, kind of tell people what it's about. Um, it is this woman who is a reporter. She hears about these families where the, non-speaking autistic children are able to have conversations with their parents without their parents even knowing that they are like basically in their heads, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, are
Mm-hmm.
able to see the things they're able to see. They do some experiments in the sense of someone's holding up a picture or a word or a number combination and asks them, what number do you see? What letter do you see? What picture do you see? And with like, in most of the cases, it was like 100% clarity. They essentially identify exactly what the parent is looking at. They're sometimes not in the same room. They're
Mm-hmm.
sometimes not even like looking at each other. There's nothing to show that there's any interaction here that would allow for this to happen. What they have noticed, though, is that if they have a strong relationship with the person, whether it's a caregiver or there is a clear connection of
Mm-hmm.
you are someone I know, I trust, I love, and that is a mutually beneficial experience,
Mm-hmm.
the connection is very strong
Mm-hmm.
and they see and hear and feel everything that that person is experiencing. And they have a variety of families that they go through that show degrees to what this can look like. And I think the first two are like, oh my goodness. But I think by the time you get to the young man who is literally convening with other autistic children in a space they have deemed called the hill,
Mm-hmm.
is when you're like, oh, we really don't understand anything. Because
Yeah.
now it's one thing communicating with us as non autistic speaking people. It's
Mm-hmm.
another thing when you are able to communicate with your own and there is a very clear shared understanding and there's a very clear shared opportunity to be seen by your
Mm-hmm.
own. I
Mm-hmm.
think that is just, for me, that is what I walked away with, was like, we actually are the ones that need to learn. We
Mm-hmm.
are actually the ones that need to get our ish together because,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I'm concerned, the light is on, everyone's home, everyone knows what's going on. If anything, they're looking at us sideways and wondering what we're doing.
Yeah.
Why are you here with all the so called faculties and you can't put things together and treat me a certain way and do things a certain way. So um, it's given me, I think, a bigger perspective on not only this community, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I agree that it's probably fear of exploitation or
Mm-hmm.
fear of anything we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't want to be treated like, you know, I don't want to say lab rats, but people
Mm-hmm.
here when you don't
Mm-hmm.
understand, and you've got two different ways and paradigms of thinking about this,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got a group that doesn't believe you, and like we don't need you to believe us. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we exist, we're here, we understand. You don't believe it, that's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
So if we keep to ourselves and we do what we need to do, If you want to be in community with us and benefit from this, fantastic, but we don't want to be exploited. And you can say this for so many types of
So many things. Yeah.
marginalized communities, right?
Yeah.
I think about the queer community. I think about, indigenous cultures. Like, we have an understanding and a shared, of how we do things. And if it doesn't make sense to you, it's not for you.
Mm-hmm.
But if it makes sense to us, then let us live. And so I think when you've seen other communities become just taken advantage of, called names, dehumanized, all the things, I can understand their reticence to even let this become a public thing, because how will we capitalize and use this? It's not going to be how can we keep this community intact, or how can we revere and lift up this community. It's going to be an extractive process. And when you understand that they have premonitions and
Mm-hmm.
that there's clairvoyance and there's clairaudience, and there's an opportunity to use something like this in a not so great way,
Mm-hmm.
I can understand why someone would say, you know what, we don't want everybody to know that we can do these things.
Yeah. I think one of the things that does protect these abilities and that space, the Hill and these other spaces that they've created in community, is this link, to your point, of that close connection and that deep relationship. So you'll see and hear stories throughout the podcast about caregivers, about teachers, parents, loved ones of these autistics who are non-speaking. And I think it's really beautiful that for a person like me or you to participate in that shared kind of mind to mind connection, which is another way that they kind of express, not just the telepathy or the clairvoyance or some of these other things, is that there's really, I think that folks that are in a position to, or motivated in a way that is not pure, that is not aligned with the common language that this group has, that's really about love and helping others and being in community. I mean, that the other part of it that is so heartwarming to me is to hear the language that is coming from these people who are nonverbal, and the beauty of their sentences and the thought and the feeling and the emotion behind them. They talk at one point about a linguist who studies language that is coming out of different times, throughout history and locations and things like that. And this linguist said that this is really like nothing she's ever seen before. It's completely new and unique and different. And so that to me also is really beautiful, that you see these themes of, helping others and living in peace and harmony and love. And it says to me that there's so much more depth to the human experience than most of us are receiving. And I think about the noise of everything these days. And I'm guilty of it too. I am listening to a podcast, or I've got a show in the background, or I've got a fan on, I'm doing all these different things, and then you've got like the notification noise and your phone is ringing, and you've got an alert from a social media platform, and ding, my email just went off, those types of noise. And I think this idea of when we are able to participate, it's because we have quieted our minds, we have gotten on the same level, we've really focused, and we really have this belief in that person or the community and are able to participate because of that. And I do think that a lot of the caregivers, a lot of the teachers, a lot of the parents know how to attune themselves at this point to be able to listen and hear and participate. But some of the potential uses, I find just astonishing. Like there's a person who had the ability to sense a medical issue. And some of these folks who are autistic and non-speaking, have savant-like abilities. It might be language. There's several examples of children on this podcast who speak a variety of languages that aren't spoken at home and do it fluently. There are people who can pick up, just by communing with someone who has written or has read a certain book, all of the knowledge that came from that book. So I think that there's endless opportunities, to connect and to benefit from this. And I think there's a way to do it without jeopardizing the safety of the community. But I also think that there's this awakening that needs to happen before that, where we see these people with autism who are non-speaking, and we value them for where they are and for what their gifts are. And even if we can't physically see it, it doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'd walked away from this podcast realizing, is that we aren't ready. We are not ready to do and be who we need. It's one thing to give them a device so they can communicate. Or the physical, the material things, right? The material things that we value or that we think are great. It's another thing to switch our whole mindset on what value a skill that isn't a tangible skill has.
Yes.
Like your ability to feel something, your ability to intuit that this is what's going on. And I think because there are people who are speaking, because I'm going to talk about the clairvoyant, psychic, medium community.
Yes.
And highly sensitive people. Like there's a group, again, variety of names get thrown out. Telepathy tapes is what she calls this. Telepathy. We've always talked about ESP. We all have moments when you're thinking about someone and they call you, or moments when you are thinking about something and then you tell someone else and they were like, I was thinking about that too. So we have moments of it that happen in our consciousness already. It's just because that is not our number one mode of communication with each other. We don't place value in it to the degree that when that is your only mode of communication, that is a high value.
Yeah.
And so I think about how, and they have the whole thing on pets. We could literally go down that rabbit hole.
Yes.
Because there's an episode where they talk about pets and telepathy with pets. And they use an example of a man who communed with elephants. And he created a sanctuary for them. And they, I think, were fully realizing of this. And then they could feel that he had a medical distress call, which resulted in his death. And 2 days later, these elephants show up at this man's house. His wife is like, what is going on? Nobody went and told the elephants, right? No one sent an email to them, right? They show up. They are clearly aware that his energy field is not here on Earth anymore. And they stay at his house. And they come back every year on the anniversary of his death. They don't have a calendar. They don't have a notification. And anyone who's got a pet, we talk about our pets all the time. They can't speak to us, but we know their barks. We know when they give us certain kind of eye contact. We know when they show up in a certain type of energy. It's an energy of either, I need your attention, I need to go to the restroom, or I need more food or water, or they need something, And how do we know this? Because we can feel the energy of the pet in front of us trying to get our attention. And when you've been in communion with them for a long time, you already know what they need. You don't even have to guess which of those.
Well, and now you have, dogs that are talking through buttons and other animals as well. And I think of Bunny, the talking dog, which is one of my favorites to follow. And it's not just, Bunny wants a treat. The other one of the most just heart-wrenching and interesting videos I saw was when Bunny started asking why she was a dog. There's clearly
That's conscious.
consciousness there. Yeah. I think too, what is so interesting is this example of, the idea that if we know someone is blind, we know that they'll have extra perception in their other additional senses. Or if someone is deaf, they have extra abilities in terms of maybe lip reading and just more senses than if they would have the ability to hear. And so I think about this, if you're a person who is non speaking and autistic, autism is like a fingerprint. It's not a line or a spectrum. I think of it like a wheel, and I think about all of these different things that a person has to do. So your ability to have fine motor skills, your ability to communicate, your ability to, do certain daily tasks. And everybody has a different, I don't want to say score, but a different experience of each of those things, which leads to the unique expression that they have of autism. And I think because of that, there are people that are talked about in this podcast who also have difficulty with their fine motor skills. And so they have to have that assistance to learn to spell or to speak. And that's also where some of the naysayers to that mode of communication come in, because they say, well, it's the words of the caregiver or the person that's helping them, which I don't think can be proved at all, just knowing that there's so much consistency in what these folks are saying all across the country, all across age ranges, special interests, etc. I think it's just a fascinating, mind-bending subject, and I listened to it twice because I felt like I got to the end and I had been on the edge of my seat the entire time, that I wanted to go back and really soak in and absorb this, because I do think, to your point, Garland, we're not ready, but I think we need to be ready. We need an expanded consciousness. We need to be willing to believe in more that we cannot see, and our interconnectedness. And I think you look at what's happening in the world today in a number of different ways and just see what happens when we are not a part of the universal consciousness, part of nature. I think about the fires. I think about the political disagreements and disharmony that we have. I just think there's an opportunity for us to really appreciate that, this idea of disability versus ability, to me, I feel like I even want to throw that on its head as well, because I think these are abilities that we don't have. And, if the majority of the community is speaking and non-autistic, but we don't have these great abilities that these folks have, who's really disabled? Because I think their experience is very different than ours.
That is 100% it. So we have a neurodiversity at work episode that we did that
Yes.
you should listen to, because that
Yes.
we like take this so conversation and we apply it to work. So do listen to that. But also, when I think about what you're saying about just turning disability on its head and just this whole, I think the spectrum, the fingerprint, just using different words
Mm-hmm.
to explain that honestly, we are all differently, uniquely gifted in
Mm-hmm.
different areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you start to look at it as everyone's just differently created,
Mm-hmm.
there's no better or worse,
No.
or like, you know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is, oh, so this is who you, oh, this is you. Got
Mm-hmm.
you. All right,
Mm-hmm.
got you. Oh, this is you. Got you. And we're not putting people in boxes and categories. We just accepting of them as they come, who they
Yeah.
are. This is what it is. And I think that concept is so far from our understanding
Yes.
right now as a world, as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is definitely something that we just need to work on. So I'm going to ask you to talk about Camp Wampler, because
Yes.
I feel like a part of your just fascination with this podcast is because you have firsthand experience, and have been working behind the scenes as well as in front of the scene with this camp. I want you to talk about this camp,
Yeah,
what it means to you, insights that you've had as a result of this podcast. Because I honestly think that it will crystallize for our listeners why this is even something we're talking about.
for sure. Well, first I want to say to your point about everybody has different skills, abilities, values, things that they bring to the table. I think up until now, and hopefully not much longer, will we assign value to people based on what their contribution is to a capitalistic society. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that we put value on having a certain amount of intellect in the traditional sense, and a certain amount of drive and enthusiasm and communication and all of these things. But I truly believe, and this is to Camp Wamp as well, Camp Wamp is all about what you can do. I think there's a tremendous amount of ability in this community. So Camp Wamp is summer camp for kids with physical disabilities. It's free for the kids to attend. So as you might imagine, raising a kid with disabilities in the US and in any country is very expensive. So not only is it, a respite from a cost standpoint, it also gives the family time and a break from caregiving, which is also can be a very challenging thing. The camp is near Lake Tahoe. It's 129 acres of pristine woodlands. It's actually a former Girl Scout camp that has been renovated and made more accessible. And the idea is that the entire week, the kids are sleeping under the stars, they're learning about nature, they're playing games, they're doing art projects, they're having fun, but their focus is really about what they can do, what their abilities are, and celebrating being in community with each other. I think when these kids come from all across the country, oftentimes they might be the only one in their class, or one of a small number in their classrooms. And I think the ability for them to be in community with one another, the opportunity to learn from and talk to Steve. So Steve Wampler is the founder of the camp. He was born with a very severe form of cerebral palsy. He only has real use of one of his limbs and uses a motorized wheelchair to get around. Stephen's family did not treat him any differently than his other siblings. And so Stephen was mainstreamed into school, and this is back at a time where if he would have been born just one generation earlier, he would have been institutionalized. But thankfully his parents, and specifically his mother, was really a trailblazer and said, Stephen will go to school, Stephen will go to camp, he will do all these sorts of things. And he had a life-changing experience at a summer camp for kids with physical disabilities. And so when he had the opportunity to change careers, he said, I want to do the same thing. That's how Camp Wamp came to be. And, he's just an astonishingly inspirational person. He's also climbed El Capitan in Yosemite doing pull-ups in a sled over, I want to say it was, I always get this wrong, I think 5 days and 6 nights. I don't know, one of the two of those. So it took him over 20,000 pull-ups to scale the summit of El Capitan, and he did it again to show what people with disabilities can do. And so I was lucky enough, just by chance, to be connected with the foundation. I first volunteered as a lunch lady. My favorite title is that I'm a third string lunch lady at Camp Wamp. Being lunch lady is the best because everybody's happy to see you. Everybody's happy to have lunch and dinner and all of those things. So I got to know the Wamplers through volunteering, and then very quickly just really found a passion for the work that they were doing, started to help them with marketing and a variety of different projects that they were working on. One including Main Street, which is a course for the general public to learn more about disabilities and the topics at most common disabilities and things like that. And now I'm a board member, and it's just, I can't really explain in words how much it has changed my life, changed my heart, seeing the beauty in disability and the possibility and the potential of these kids. I do think that there is more to the story. with folks who are non-speaking, and I do think the potential is there. I think this idea of spelling and these boards and these devices, I think, have the opportunity to really change and revolutionize, the lives that these folks with disabilities are having. And I mean, imagine being in a body and not having the ability to communicate, and the frustration and all of the emotions that go with that. I just think it's something that I don't understand why people resist. I don't agree that the caregivers are talking on behalf of the person. I think, they're helping these folks to feel in their body, which is, the proprioception, or we'll put the word in the show notes. This disconnection between the physical body and the mind really exists within this community. And I think anything that we can do to unleash the power of these folks, I think, is absolutely important, and something that I hope to see very.
Yeah, you're giving empowerment. Like, we
Yeah.
need to empower people to be able to um, not only just exist like as is
Mm-hmm.
without anyone's labels and titles and things, but just give them a space for them to be with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to try to make it out to Camp Wamp this summer,
I want you to.
because I
Yes.
feel like well, one, camp is not I didn't grow up going to camp. I'll just tell you that. I went to one camp one time. It was fine. Keep in mind, I'm a picky eater. So I ate green salad for the first time at camp, because Garland wasn't eating green salad before. Yeah. That's a whole nother podcast. Picky eating. Um, now I eat everything.
Yes, you do. You do.
um, but it was definitely, I think, camp for me growing up as a city kid.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily having nature as a part of my everyday or even weekly experience. I think camp was that shutting out the noise you talk about, that being
Yes.
able to commune with nature and be, listening to sounds, natural sounds. You're not
Mm-hmm.
hearing sirens and horns and helicopters and all of these things that we hear in the city, that are, I think, far more pleasing to the ear, calming to the spirit.
Yes.
And so camp is definitely that. And so I can only imagine for kids who, are always probably being, made to do things and moved places, they can do what they want
Yeah.
and be open and free to do that. I think it sounds like an awesome place. So
Yeah.
today was a plug for Camp Wamp, but also
Yes.
just, I think for me, that what I am enjoying about this podcast is, because it's number one podcast, this message is getting out there.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I'm really grateful for that. And I really think, the people who have studied this, including Dr. Diane Powell and others, I feel have been hopefully redeemed in what they've done. I think the way that they've put together all of these different tests and studies is so rigorous and unassailable. I don't know at this point how you could argue against it. It's that convincing. It really is. But I'm just so happy that we talked about it, because I do think awareness is the biggest thing. I think, disabilities, people with disabilities make up over 1 billion people on this earth. They are the largest, I think, minority, and oftentimes unspoken. And so it's great to have this topic out in the mainstream. And I'm just so excited to hear from people what they took away from the podcast. I want everybody to listen to it. I'm begging you, please. It'll change your heart. It'll change your mind. And this was so fun to talk about with you, Garland. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was the best.
Awesome. Well,
All
thank you for
right.
joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode. We hope you'll listen to the telepathy tapes and let us know what you think and if you like the episode. Any topics or tips or questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social. And thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Unraveled with Garland and Allison. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.